So it's a pleasure to introduce our next speaker, John Hawthorne, professor at the University of Southern California, and before that at Oxford. As you'll know, Professor Hawthorne has published very influential work on different topics in metaphysics, epistemology, philosophy of language. And today he's going to talk about the new Chisholm paradox. So thank you.
Okay, do I need to turn this on?
Yeah,
the
red button.
Okay, does that work? Yeah, okay. Well, thank you. I was originally going to give a paper that I wrote with Jeff Russell, but the deadline for submitting the final version has passed for that, so it seemed better to talk about something I'm currently working on. And this, my remarks will connect to a much longer thing in progress with Yohani Bakari here. So he's very much the co-author. I'll talk for about 45 minutes, yes, and then stop. I'm going to make some remarks in the vicinity of a set of puzzles that's often known as Chisholm's paradox. And I want to give you a feel for how the puzzle is often introduced in the literature. I'll introduce it a little bit more abstractly than it sometimes is. So the topic is how much individuals can vary, perhaps along certain parameters, with respect to their characteristics. What kinds of shapes couldn't I have had? What kind of ion content couldn't I have had as part of my material makeup, and so on. And in very many cases, I'm not saying there's a general recipe for answering questions like this, but in very, very many cases, a combination of answers seems kind of intuitively natural to many people. First thought, a tolerance thought. This or that could have been a little bit different along the relevant parameter. But second thought, and not too much tolerance thought, a thing couldn't have been way different along that parameter. For example, as applied to origins, which is the focal example in a lot of this literature, a table could have been made from a block of wood that had just a few wood cells different, but that very table couldn't have been made from a block of wood which had a wildly different makeup in terms of the individual wood cells that made up the block. But let's just to give you another sort of example, we might take a particular musical performance, and it might be natural to think, oh, that could have been a second longer. Yeah, that's a tolerance thought. It couldn't have been 2 billion years longer. That's not too much tolerance thought. But the thing is that it also seems quite natural to people, giving first pass sort of judgments in this area, that the tolerance thought isn't just true by accident. It's not just true at our world, as it were, that tables could have been a little bit different in their origin, but that's something that is a modally robust phenomenon. Take any possible table. That could have been made from a block of wood that's a little bit different in terms of its wood cell makeup. But when you necessitate the tolerance thought, there's an abject clash between the necessitated tolerance thought and the not too much tolerance thought. And you can see it in the case of the symphony. If any possible symphony could have been a second longer, and this symphony could have been a second longer, then it could have been 2 seconds longer, because as it were, just go to the world where it's a second longer than it is here, and then apply the tolerance again. And keep applying, and you get to 2 billion years. So it seems on the one hand that the tolerance thought's true, on the other hand it's pretty natural to necessitate it, on the other hand the not too much tolerance thought seems true, and if we just buy into all that, we're left mired in paradox, and so the task of philosophers is to extricate us from the mess. Okay? The version of the puzzle that I just gave relied on iterated modalities. The necessitated version of the tolerance principle basically embeds a possibility claim under a necessity claim. And so it's an iterated modality thought. But I think it's worth realizing, and one or two people have realized this, that there's a somewhat similar argument that doesn't involve iterated modalities, but is much more familiar in that it seems it has a Sorites structure, something like this. Think of a series of Sorites premises. Well, if something could have been a second longer, it could have been 2 seconds longer. If it could have been 2 seconds longer, it could have been 3 seconds longer. If it could have been 3 seconds longer, it could have been 4 seconds longer. Think of, those are all prima facie quite natural thoughts, but of course when you string them together and then apply them sequentially, you'll be running into a headlong clash with the not too much tolerance thought. Given a natural default background logic of S5, there's nothing really much to choose between the iterated modality argument and the Sorites argument. In a very natural sense, when you write them down properly, they stand or fall together. Given that then the Chisholm's paradox is either a Sorites argument or something logically equivalent to a Sorites argument, the natural thing to do, an off-the-shelf thing to do is just take Sorites makes us think about vagueness. We take our standard, our favourite treatment of vagueness, whatever it is, epistemicism or whatever, or some really fancy thing, kits that I don't understand quite yet, we take our favourite treatment and we apply it to the case and then we call it good. That's a natural thing to do. And I think in very many cases, that is pretty much all that we need to do. And it does seem good to do that and then call it good. Let's take a case where, we take a tiger, and then we keep applying a couple of tolerance ideas again and again and again. One is a shape tolerance thing where, it could always be just a little bit more round or something. And another is an iron tolerance idea. It could always have just an extra little bit of iron in its material constitution. And think just of a sequence whereby, by, as it were, baby step appliance of the shape tolerance and iron tolerance, one goes from a tiger to a cannonball. That's an instance of this sort of Sorites thing in action. It's natural to think, tigers are essentially alive. At some point, you get to something that's borderline alive, but throw a bit more iron in, and that just takes it over the edge. It's a little bit vague. What takes a thing over the edge from being alive to not alive? You might not want to call it dead either. Maybe it depends on the details of how the story goes. It's natural to just wheel out one's favourite apparatus of vagueness and say, well, somewhere perhaps in the cut between alive or not alive, or maybe if earlier on it stops being a tiger, as it were, maybe you want to have a cut there. But, at one of those crucial junctures, the essentiality, of tigerhood or being alive just says no more. And that's it. And all we've got left is a standard case of vagueness. And I think that is a pretty good way of treating certain kinds of Chisholm puzzles, as it were. But there are others that I think are a bit more resilient, hence the name, the new Chisholm puzzle. One thing to notice about the tiger case is once you think about this in the way that I did, you wouldn't have complete security that tolerance is true even for actual tigers. I mean, maybe there's some actual tiger that's only just a tiger. I mean, I don't know. I mean, certainly wouldn't be surprised if somewhere in the history of the world there's a bicycle that's only just a bicycle, you know, and then if you distort the plan anymore in the direction of being a Winchester rifle or something, it's going to, it will call it quits, so to speak. So, you know, I think it's on reflection, tolerance principles of shape for bicycles, tolerance principles of iron for tigers, we don't have complete security that they're even true of all actual tigers and all actual bicycles. In other cases, just our intuitive reaction, and I think this connects to why certain examples have been focused on in the literature, we seem to feel much more security. Like when it comes to a table, we feel completely secure that it could have, for any particular appropriate wood cell external to the table and wood cell within the block that made the table could have been made from a block with those two swapped. So that one that's outside is inside and the one that's inside is outside. We feel real security about that in a way, and I can't get myself into a situation of doubting as easily as I did with the table, with the bicycle tolerance and the tiger tolerance. So I think there is a residual puzzle if you have that feeling that we're completely home free with, say, the origin tolerance for tables. And I think that's just an example. There are other similar examples. Because it feels, on the one hand, we want not too much tolerance. And on the other hand, our sense of security is going to be alive with the thought that, hey, we're not just lucking out here. Pretty much anyone just like us in a qualitatively similar situation, in a qualitatively similar world, would have been making a true speech by the tolerance speech. It's not that, thank goodness we don't have any intolerant tables around, but, you know, it's there are skeptical scenarios which look exactly like this qualitatively. It's just that there's a rogue intolerant table that's had enough in terms of its origin, so a certain swap couldn't happen. That seems really, really strange. But we've still got a puzzle if we want to enforce that sense of security and also think that there's something right about not too much tolerance, because here we've got a table. There will be an edge world where a certain kind of swap isn't possible, because that would involve too much departure from the origin here, so where the table there couldn't tolerate a certain kind of swap, and then that would make it seem that the people in that world, I mean, there'll be no telltale signs about the table in that world. They'll make the tolerant speech. It'll look just like a regular table. They'll just be out of luck. And if you start to think that's possible, if you really start to think that could well be possible in a world qualitatively just like this, then you'll start to think, hey, why should I be so supremely confident about my tolerant speech of the actual world? So that's the thing we call the new Chisholm paradox. How to marry the kind of security. Try and say these things more carefully, but I'm being a little kind of casual. How to marry the kind of security we're talking about with not too much tolerance. On the one hand, and the truth of tables are completely intolerant on the other. Okay. I think it's worth noting that there are diachronic puzzles. I'm not going to make a huge deal out of this, but it'll be important in one connection. There are diachronic puzzles that have a slightly similar flavour. I think origin theoretic cases are hard to turn into diachromic puzzles. But other sorts of cases, one could run modally or diachromically. So, I mean, this is a bit far-fetched, but it will make it vivid for you. Imagine there's an eternal painter who has a painting and then, you know, makes small adjustments. I mean, the painter's taste change. She, becomes enamored with impressionist style at one point, and then, other kinds of styles, so, and the change happens very slowly, so there are just very small little dabs and adjustments to the painting, and, at one point there's something that resembles, English landscape in the style of William Constable, and a few thousand years later there's something that resembles a dreamlike scene in the style of Salvador Dali, and it seems pretty far-fetched to say they're the same painting. I mean, if you start to say they're the same painting, then you have to start taking seriously the thought that pointing to a Salvador Dali, that very painting could have exactly duplicated a portion of the Sistine Chapel, and that seems kind of wild. But on the other hand, it seems that the painter at each point could, have a pretty respectable tolerance of the form. Hey, I'm not going to destroy this painting just by having a tiny little dab, in that little region. A little dab won't destroy the painting. That's a tolerance thought. But if we have a not too much tolerance thought, and we want the relevant sort of security, so it's not just at some crucial times the painter's out of luck, and the painting in front of him or her has had enough, so to speak, so that one little dab will destroy it. If you don't like that thought, if you want the painter's speech to be true at each point in time, then there's something of a real puzzle. How do you think of that? So the painter's speech is true at each point. Okay, that's the diachronic version of the puzzle. Now let me, I haven't been going very long.
20 minutes, I mean, less than 20 minutes.
Yeah, so let me run through some reactions of various friends, or predicted reactions of various friends to this kind of puzzle. There are some views I might mention that I can't go through all the views. I'm really going to juxtapose just a few views. A thing that I'm not going to talk about, which some of you will certainly be drawn to, is to try to treat the modal thing, at least, in a counterpart theoretic way. That's a respectable approach. It's not my style. Team Oxford doesn't really do things that way. So I don't like being on Team Oxford, but I'd like to find some interesting things to say about that. Jessica Wilson has an approach that really relies on contextualism about the box operator, so that at each context S5 is true, but at different contexts, taking different worlds as actual, to use a phrase she's borrowed from Dave Chalmers. Different worlds are different domains are accessible, so to speak. That's how it works. So we get a contextualism in the box. I'm not going to talk about that. A thing to notice, of course, is not clear that the new Chisholm's paradox is going to arise for every sort of ontology. I mean, if you're a nihilist that just believes in metaphysical simples, all this bicycle to rifle stuff isn't going to arise, because there aren't bicycles and there aren't rifles. And I think similarly, Peter, he has a bit more than that. He has tigers and so on, but he thinks of tables, rifles, and so on as kind of metaphysical garbage, so to speak. And one might diagnose this problem as a roughly garbage in, garbage out kind of thing. We're dealing with metaphysical garbage, and no wonder we get into trouble by trying to come up with really nice systematic theories about it, and that's just reflective of the fact that these things aren't there in reality, so to speak. So that's another very respectable view. It's not one that I'm going to really say much about. I'm going to talk about three views. One, the view that I sort of seem to get talking to Tim Williamson and reading Identity and Discrimination. Another view popularized by Hugh Chandler and following him, Nathan Salmon. And then finally, a view that was mentioned in conversation to a few people by Eli Hirsch, is gestured at in a very condensed paragraph in Williamson's Identity and Discrimination with credit to Hirsch, and is in fact the view we like because it builds on a way of thinking about ontology that we're antecedently sympathetic to. So they're the Williamson, what I'll call the Williamson view, I mean, it's flat-footed in a certain kind of way. It says we know the not too much tolerance thing, but has a rather different attitude to the tolerance thing. We shouldn't be thinking of ourselves as knowing the tolerance thing in full generality. We don't just know in full generality that every table is tolerant in the relevant origin theoretical way. Now, there's certain kinds of positive statuses, certain statuses that the tolerance thing might still have. For example, it might be an excellent heuristic, the tolerance thing, and it might be we'll never spot a table that fails the tolerance thing. So as it were, we'll never find a particular counterexample to the tolerance thing. So there are no known, there's never going to be a particular known counterexample. So, you know, just, it's not that it's got nothing going for it, the tolerance thing. You'll never know there's a particular thing as a counterexample to it, and it might be an excellent heuristic, but still, you shouldn't be so sure it's true in full generality. I should say this version of Williamson, at least, thinks you can still know a table is tolerant. I mean, just to give you the feel for this, I mean, the way he'd be thinking is, well, your environment often helps you out by providing a safe niche to enable you to know. If I look at a chair and I think it will support me, I can know that. Even though in other situations, a superficially similar chair would have a hidden weakness that wouldn't support me and I'd just be out of luck. If I point to a tolerant table and the nearest intolerant table is, say, in Salamanca, then maybe my environment is providing a safe enough niche such that I couldn't have easily been making a mistake, so I can get to even know that a table is tolerant in this kind of not fully satisfying safety theoretic rounded way. So, you know, that's the view. That's the kind of picture you get from identity and discrimination. I mean, the knowledge thing maybe is something added on by some later stuff, but that's the kind of picture that you get. And, you know, it's not so much, I mean, I think it's maybe our second favourite view, so we're not like really antithetical to it, but it does seem, a bit weird. It's not that we think, oh, well, if that were true, you'd never be able to know a table's tolerant. I don't want to say that. But a view can be ontologically bizarre even despite not having that kind of weakness. I mean, suppose, for example, that someone had the view that sometimes when simples arrange table-wise, they make a table. But sometimes, and there's no real rhyme or reason, they just don't. They don't compose a table. Just occasionally, they kind of fall flat, as it were, and they don't compose. And, you know, I wouldn't want to say if that was true, you could never know you're looking at a table. I mean, maybe if you're looking at a table and the nearest collection of simples arranged table-wise that failed to compose a table was in Salamanca, maybe you're in a safe haven and you can get to know that you're looking at a real bona fide existent table. But it's completely bizarre still, the view. I mean, I really feel it there. It's completely wacky, that kind of view. I don't have that stronger reaction of bizarreness here. But the idea that there's an intolerant table in Salamanca that couldn't have had its origin switched in a certain way, you know, there's a certain wood cell inside and a certain wood cell outside that's pretty much a duplicate, but it couldn't, so to speak, have existed in a world where those two were switched. But, you know, for all other tables, any pairwise switch would have been fine. It seems at least just a little bizarre. It takes some getting used to. Second favourite view, I don't want to knock it too much, as we say in England, but, you know, it does take some getting used to. So that's view number one for your perusal. View number two, the Chandler-Salmon view. As I said, the stand or fall together feature of the iterated modality argument and the Soriades argument relied on a background S5 logic. The key move of Chandler and then Salmon is to deny S5 and crucially to deny S4. So the idea is necessarily every table is tolerant, i.e. necessarily for any wood cell in its origin and any wood cell outside its origin, it could have existed while having those switched other things being the same, so to speak. But that doesn't mean it's possible for this table to have been made out of that switch, because what's possibly possible isn't always possible. The key move then is what's possibly possible isn't always possible. It gives us an elegant answer to the new Chisholm puzzle. While as it were, there is an edge case in terms of possibility. There's a block such that this table could have been made from that block, but couldn't be made from a block that was just switched in a subtle way. But that doesn't mean that the people in that world would be speaking falsely if they made the tolerant speech, because people in that world would be speaking truly, because while the world a little further along isn't accessible to this world, it is accessible to that world. That's the recipe. That's the basic recipe for making, intuitively, and this could be all regimented a bit, for making the problem go away. There's some fun metaphysics that I think is a bit underexplored that you can do in an S4 denying setting. I think it'd be fun. We've been having a bit of fun with this. I mean, take Williamson's earrings puzzle. Well, I'll give you a table version. So it's a Chisholm-style puzzle, except it's run in a case where the table isn't actually made. So there's a whole sequence of plans that have the same sort of design, but have slightly different recipes for which wood particles to use. So as it were, the plans are in a circle, I'm embellishing a bit, and each pair of plans is only pairwise different in one wood cell from which collection of wood cells you're instructed to use. And you walk around and around, and you're invited to pick a plan to make a table, and maybe you have a heart attack and die, and no table's made. Okay? Take one of the plans. Think about the table, let's call it Jones, that would have been created if that plan had been implemented. A natural tolerance thought is, well, Jones would have been created then if you'd have used the plan just one to the right. But then if we keep doing that, then we seem to get a kind of violation of the not too much tolerance thought, because then we end up saying, oh, it could have been made from that, and also from that, even though that and that had no wood cells in common in terms of the wood cells that you're instructed to use. So that's the Williamson puzzle. It's run on, if we're thinking in a necessitous way, on non-concrete possible tables. there's all sorts of things you can play with if you're an S5 denier. The most conservative thing, which I think Salmon goes for in a few very abbreviated remarks, don't really use the resources of S4 denial at all in this setting. It just relies on vagueness in terms of what's possible, and I don't want to go into how to fill out that model, but there are models where it's all about vagueness in terms of what's possible. But there are other things you can play with too. I mean, here's one kind of picture. Actually, non-concrete tables, they're not very fussy. You can make them from any block of wood you like. It's possible to make this from that, and that. But once they're made, as it were, at worlds where they're made from a block of wood, it's not possible to make them from very different blocks. So that's, as it were, a failure of a Euclidean triangle. It's possible to make it from that, it's possible to make it from that, but at that world is impossible, and at that world is impossible. So this is a picture according to which non-concrete tables, they're not very fussy. Tables are only fussy in worlds where they're made, where they kind of get a concrete essence, as it were. I think that's a cool kind of, another kind of picture goes the other way. I think this is less natural to my mind. Non-concrete tables are extremely fussy. They're very intolerant. They say, you can only make me by using exactly that set of wood cells. But of course, at worlds where they're made, they're rather less fussy. Once you make them, they'll tolerate, as it were, being made from slightly different blocks of wood. These are all wild and wonderful possibilities that open up in an S4 denying setting, and I think they're sort of fun to think about. But nevertheless, I think S4 denial is it ranks bottom in terms of the three views that I'm presenting you with today. There are some methodological issues, general methodological issues I'll mention. I'm not going to harp on them too much, but are we really going to start changing our logic, because of a couple of puzzles about tables? I feel it's a little weird methodologically. It's one thing to deny S4 because one's got a counterpart theoretic vision of the underlying reality, but I think it's another thing to just base one's denial of S4 on a few origin theoretic puzzles about tables and shifts. Another general thing it's worth remembering that the iterated modality puzzle seems like it's logically equivalent to the Sorides puzzle in terms of our background intuitive default logic, or at least as we're thinking of it. It seems a bit weird to us to solve the problem by saying that apparently logically equivalent arguments aren't logically equivalent after all. There's something perhaps a little funny going on there that needs bearing about and thinking about. And it turns out that Salmon has to offer a rather different solution to the Sorides version, because S4 denial doesn't really speak to the Sorides version, and indeed, predictably, he wheels out a vagueness theoretic solution to the Sorides puzzle. So it bears thinking about whether we should be going for radically different solutions to paradoxical arguments that seem pretty theoretically to be logically equivalent. Maybe make a few more concrete remarks. This is all very interesting, but a few more concrete remarks about why we don't like the S4 denial thing. Reason number one, it doesn't speak at all to the diachronic puzzle. Remember, I presented you with diachronic puzzles. If you went in for the S4 denial to the Chisholm's puzzle, it wouldn't apparently be very helpful at all to the diachronic puzzle. And if you were trying in a flat-footed way just to adapt it to the diachronic puzzle, you might be trying thoughts like, well, will doesn't entail will, but that doesn't seem any good. Denying that will doesn't entail will. So there's nothing very suggestive by way of the modal the S49 solution to the modal puzzle that gives us much purchase on the diachronic puzzle. So it is incumbent on those folks to provide a pretty convincing case that the diachronic puzzle is really a very different kind of phenomenon to the modal puzzle. And then another general remark that I'll just leave you with, and then present you with my own, with the correct picture of things. There is the phenomenon of ancestral possibility in salmon. I mean, there's what's possible, possibly possible, possibly possible. You know, there are the things that for some number of diamonds are possible, as it were. One can define up some notion of ancestral possibility. And it turns out that salmon's view is, Guess's view is that it's ancestrally possible that I, duplicate a slice of Iberico corn-fed ham. There's a world where I'm just like that. There is a world where I'm just like that. It's ancestrally possible. It's just not possible. So he has this space of worlds. He's got these operators like in W. In that world, yada yada. And one just wonders what's the argument that that isn't the real topic of metaphysical modality? It feels like what he's talking about is some restricted modality, and the real topic of metaphysical modality is what's going on at all the worlds, so to speak. That's the domain of study, it feels like, for metaphysical modality. I mean, one way into this, I'm not saying the only way, is if you like, Tim Williamson's thought that metaphysical modality is the broadest objective modality. If you start thinking that, it just feels like this at all worlds in this at all worlds operator that you could that is fair game in Salmon's own system looks like a much better candidate for the broadest objective modality than the thing he calls what's possible and what's necessary, as it were. So I think there's a real issue why we shouldn't be thinking of the space of worlds that he talks about as the real subject matter for metaphysical modality. And then, if that's right, it'll turn out that he's one of these I could have been a poached egg guys, and what he's then doing is making the speech that the could have been poached egg guys often make, which is, oh, well, often we use restricted modalities, and when we use restricted modalities, the claim, I could have been a poached egg, is false. So I think there's a good question why he's not really good, could have been a poached egg guy, just with a little bit of different window dressing to distract us, so to speak. Okay, that gives you a preliminary flavour of why we don't like S4 denial, though as I said, I think it's fun to think about and hasn't been explored quite as much by metaphysicians as it might be. Let me turn finally to our top-ranking view. And it's built on a metaphysical picture that we like and some people hate, but we do like it antecedently, and so it's kind of fair game to see how the new Chisholm's puzzle looks in the light of this metaphysics. And as I said, it's an approach that was suggested a long time ago by Eli Hirsch in conversations with various people. The background metaphysics is a plenitudinous one. There isn't just the statue and the lump, but there's ever so many things coincident with any material being. And as a rough first pass, you could think that for any function from worlds to filled regions, there's an object whose there's at least one object, maybe more, there's at least one object whose modal occupation profile corresponds to that function. So there are tons of things, as it were. And I don't really want to get into making the case for plenitude right now. I mean, various people, including myself, have tried to warm people up to this. If you like plenitude, there's a very natural thing to try out in connection with the new Chisholm puzzle. And it basically relies on the idea of semantic drift. Suppose it's entrenched, the tables are essentially tables, and suppose tolerance is entrenched too, and not too much tolerance is also entrenched in our community. Well, then this table maybe could have existed in a world where a certain 10 of the originating matter was swapped out, but not 11. Let's suppose it was like that, in terms of the Canton wood cells. There's a world then where there's a certain swap is impossible. Maybe the world where 10 have been done, a certain kind of swap would have been, won't work for the table at that world. I.e., it wouldn't be possible for the table to exist with a certain swap done modally, so to speak. Well, what about the people at that world? What about their tolerant speech and their not too much tolerant speech? Well, you know, with plenitude, there are plenty of things to go around. I mean, there is something at that world. It's not the table, mind you, but there is something at that world that could survive a swap of 10 in either direction from the thing. And there's a thing that couldn't survive a swap of 11. So it's symmetrical in that respect. And the natural thing to do then is have the intention of table different at that world to this. At that world, the intention of table is such that the extension at that world of the intention isn't on the tables. There are these other things that are coincident with the table. You see what I mean? So this is the kind of thing that we learn to live with anyway, if you're sort of a plenitude kind of character. And it's just an overwhelmingly natural way to make the puzzle go away. If you've got this kind of plenitude theoretic ontology, it's overwhelmingly natural to think that, as it were, to try out a picture according to which you can have your cake and eat it. The tolerance principle's true, and at that world, the proposition expressed by the tolerance words are true. It's just there's a slight shift in the semantic value of table, and a slight shift in the referent of a demonstrative like that. Then everything can be stabilized, and we can do a similar kind of thing in the diachronic set. There are a whole bunch of issues that remain if you start really taking on this picture of semantic drift diachronically and modally. I mean, imagine a case where, you know, the word sweater drifts from something that applies to sweaters to something that applies to any piece of clothing, you know, really slowly over time. One kind of picture you might have is, well, there are periods where the semantic value is constant, and then a tipping point's reached, and then it tips over, and then another period, and then a tipping point. Or you could have a period, or you could have a picture of as it were, continuous shift in the semantic value of the word sweater during that period. And one can replicate those ideas in a modal setting too. Do we want cells of stability or something a lot less bubble-like, as it were? So there are lots of interesting points of detail, but I think what's clear is if you were antecedently sympathetic to plenitude, you should find this a very natural way to rescue yourself from perplexity when confronted with the new Chisholm puzzle. One little thing I'll point out, I mean, just to juxtapose with the S4 deniers, the claim that tables are tolerant can't be a necessary truth for us. Because after all, I mean, we're not messing around with S5. This table will reach, there is an edge case for this table such that a certain switch wouldn't, it wouldn't, so to speak, have been possible for it to have existed with a certain switch in its tiny switch in its origin. So tolerance, when you say it carefully, isn't necessarily true, but it could still have the status of something a bit like a contingent a priori truth, a little bit like. I don't want to go way in on this, but if it's entrenched in a certain way, then the semantic gods can see to it, and there's no problem seeing to it that there's something that the extension of the term table is a bunch of things that respects the tolerance principle, and same at other worlds where the tolerant speech is made. So it has something more akin to the status of a contingent a priori truth, and I'm sure that the S4 deniers would make a big deal about this and think, no, well, it's really clear to us that it has the status of a necessary truth. And I just want to juxtapose things a little bit. I mean, in other cases, there are things that feel like they're really straightforwardly necessary that are much harder, are going to be much more contingent, it would seem, for the S4 deniers. I mean, take the principle that tigers are essentially tigers. I mean, people like that. And it feels like it's not just an accident, it feels like it's got the status of a necessary truth, that tigers are essentially tigers. But S4 deniers, they're going to have a little bit of trouble with that, because after all, thinking through the pathway of ancestral possibility that they often use, there's going to be some point along there where you've got a tiger that can see a world where it isn't a tiger. So at that world, so to speak, you've got a tiger that's essentially, that's not essentially a tiger. Of course, it may seem, no problem, tigers are essentially tigers, but once you start boxing that up, so to speak, you're starting to clash with the fact that ancestral possibility will take you from, take a tiger through a path of worlds where it, at some point, stops being a tiger. So we don't quite have it that the tolerance principle is necessarily true. They're going to struggle with these essentiality principles being necessarily true, and that's that's part of the logical terrain here that needs to be understood. Okay, I've gone too long. I'm going to stop. Thank you.